Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she had healed of her diseases. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed."
Please join me in singing, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I've always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
A young boy who was raised in an astute and prominent family in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, appeared to have everything anyone could ask for. The father was very respected and relied upon businessman by many. His mother was the daughter of an equally successful businessman, and she had a heart of a saint. The whole family was steeped in a strong sense of service and strong ties to community, friends, and relatives. Little Fred Rogers had everything he needed and anything he could ask for. It seemed almost perfect. And from the outside looking in, it was. In a time of the onset of the Great Depression, here is a family that continues to carry a wealth of riches to include a butler, nanny, and a chauffeur for their child. But also a family who was notorious for giving many people loans without ever asking for a penny in return. But what you see on the outside is oftentimes not an exact reflection of what is truly taking place in the inside. For a time, Fred Rogers' childhood was difficult. He was overweight, somewhat shy and introverted. Although respiratory ailments of Western Pennsylvania were very common, Fred was sometimes homebound because his childhood asthma even kept inside air conditioning during the worst air congestion of the summer months. He felt his childhood in isolation, physical and emotional, acutely in ways that built the depth, sensitivity, and empathy that characterized his life and work as an adult. Grown-ups who noticed his sensitivity as a child advised him, just don't let on you care. Then nobody will bother you. But young Fred did care enormously. And he ended up taking great solace and guidance from his maternal grandfather. Fred's own sense of loneliness and self-doubt taught him to be aware of the insecurities and the needs of small children. And what he learned about himself and life as a child, much of it from his loving grandfather, prepared him to help millions of young children later. Fred later shared that growing up being bullied was a pivotal moment in his childhood, a moment with the potential to turn him irreparably inward, or worse, into a bully himself. Instead, it set him searching. He said, I started to look behind the things that people did and said, and after a lot of sadness, I began a lifelong search for what is essential, what it is about my neighbor that doesn't meet the eye. He noticed a need in the world, and he chose to do something about it. Rather than view it with despair, he viewed it with hope. But something more had happened. Little Fred Rogers learned in the most tangible way possible that God can be depended upon, that he is always there. In fact, Mr. Rogers said, the tough times I've been through turned out to be the times in which God's presence was so clear, so real. Author Amy Hollingsworth wrote that out of his deep hurt came a longing to soothe the pain of others. And out of callous disregard of schoolyard bullies came a determination to only lift up and never demean his neighbor. Out of God's provision for him through a loving widow came his assurance of the omnipresence of a living God. Fred's intense devotion to the disenfranchised, the least of these, arose from the realization he was one of them. And I love this story in Mark 5. In fact, it is one of my personal favorites of the woman with the issue of blood who, out of her desperate need, pushes through the throngs of people surrounding Jesus in order to just touch the hem of his garment and be healed. And you remember how this went. She had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. And we're told that she suffered from an issue of blood. And this literally means that she was hemorrhaging or bleeding out of some part of her body. And the word issue, it means a flowing of blood. And whatever may have caused this internal hemorrhage, she was a very sick woman. Because of this blood, she was suffering physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. She suffered physically from the constant blood loss. This poor woman would have been weak, anemic, and pale. She would have had no energy at all. The very least of her efforts would have worn her out. And the word plague is the same word that's translated as whip elsewhere. Her disease was like a scourge, constantly beating her down day by day. And she spent all she had on many doctors and treatments available to her. And the further we look into this, we see that she suffered under their care. Not only did she suffer physically, but socially. She could not be married because through physical contact, she would defile her husband. And if she had ever been married, her husband would have been forced to divorce her. She couldn't work around others because the danger of defilement. And this reduced her life of begging scraps of food from the distance. Can you imagine? You back there, could you just leave me what's ever left? And I'll come as soon as you're far enough away, and I'll go get it. I'll lick the floor of your crumbs. Her condition left her on the fringes of society. And it's obvious that she suffered emotionally, since the Bible says that she had been this way for 12 years, and considering the average lifespan in those days, it's safe to assume that she had probably been this way since just after puberty. She has lived her life moving from one rejection to another. She's lonely, and she's isolated, and she's desperate. For just a quick history lesson, under the law as seen in Leviticus 15:19, it says, whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until evening. And it continues on in verse 25 through 27. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. How humiliating that anything or anyone she touches would be considered unclean. And as a result, she couldn't mingle with the people in public, or else she would cause them to be defiled. And let's think about this. She's suffering physically, therefore she can't be around people. She can't go to the temple to worship because of the law. To pile on to her, she has been suffered financially, because the Bible tells us she had spent all she had. And the quack doctors and their useless remedies had not even helped her. All they had done was drained her bank account dry. She's been left penniless and destitute. And let's not neglect to mention her sorrow. After all these years, all the doctors, all the times she had hoped this remedy would be the one that would work for her, she has come to a place where she knows she is living a death sentence. She's not going to get any better. She's going to die from this disease. What she has is what's going to kill her. And her life is literally draining from her body, little by little, and day by day. And I have no doubt she just about had given up. And who really wouldn't blame her at this point? Now, heartbroken, this woman has unlooked for opportunity. Jesus has come to town. Somewhere, from some source, this woman heard about Jesus. Now, maybe she had heard that he had healed the leper. Maybe she had heard about the wild man just across the lake that Jesus had helped. Or maybe some other poor soul who lived on the fringes of society due to an uncleanliness of some kind had been healed of Jesus and came and told her about him. But no doubt she had heard that there was power in his touch. But she didn't want him to touch her. She wanted to touch him. And regardless of where she heard about it, she knew she had to get to him. She had come to realize that Jesus was her only hope. She believed with all her heart that if she could just get to him, she would be healed. And she had to be determined, because she had demonstrated great courage by approaching Jesus in a crowd. And as she elbowed her way through the people, she was causing ceremonial defilement for everyone she touched. She was taking a great risk, for if she had been recognized, she would have been subjected to more intense public humiliation and ridicule and possible retribution. A crowd like that might have gotten worked up and stoned her to death. But for her, it was a risk worth taking. She knew what Jesus had for her was what she needed, and so she had to get to him. And we know she because by the very nature of disease, it would have taken all the energy she had to drag herself out of her bed, to struggle through the crowd to get to Jesus. She was desperate. And let's pause and let's reflect here a little on our own lives. Have you reached that place in your life yet? Have you come to understand that Jesus is the only hope? Friends, if you are in this building lost today, you need to get to Jesus. You need to push yourself through the crowd and sit here at this altar. Because Jesus is the only source of salvation. And Acts 4:12 tells us salvation is found in no one else. For there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. John 14:6 says, Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have never trusted Jesus for your salvation, or maybe you're in a place of doubt, then you need to come to him. Because Jesus is our only hope. You need to touch him by faith. And others who are saved, but like this woman are burdened and defeated, need to touch him as well. And there makes no mention of whether or not this woman believed in Jesus prior to him coming to town. In all fairness, it's safe to assume she was fully aware that he was the Messiah. She would consider herself a Christian. The sooner that you come to realize that Jesus is the only person who can help you, the sooner you get the help you need. And listen to what he says to you in Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Then in Hebrews 4:15-16, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in the time of need. And finally, 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. So when I read this, it makes me ask the question, why should we carry that burden one more step? Why should you fight your battle even for one more minute? Why should you live defeated for another day? Because you don't have to. We can actually get to Jesus. He can and he will help you. And then here comes the good stuff. Here comes the healing she experienced. Now imagine right now you're on those streets with Jesus and her. He is at this moment passing by. It's not lawful for her to be there a bleeding woman, together with other people. She's dying. And she doesn't want to be. So against all odds and against the law, she presses through the crowd and she presses into Jesus. She reaches out with all the strength she yet possesses and touches him. And then she's instantly healed. Listen to this commentary. When she was near enough to touch him, she reached out a trembling hand and touched his garment. The word touch means to cling to or to adhere to. In other words, she held on to him until she got what she came after. Then, immediately, in that instance, she received what none of the doctors or their costly and painful remedies could give her. She was healed. And instantly, she felt the change in her body. She knew she was a different woman with just one touch. Let that sink in for a moment. She is instantly healed. And this story is one of those lost treasures of the gospel. You see, this was personal. As soon as the woman touches him, Jesus knows what has happened. And just for the record, he knew it was going to happen before it did. But he knows that virtue has gone out of him. And in this word, that means power. Jesus knows what has happened, and he asks in verse 30, "Who touched my clothes?" And of course, there were dozens of people touching him and bumping into him. In fact, his disciples told him that in verse 31. But her touch was different. It was a touch accompanied by faith. Many touched him, but only one touched him with the fingers of faith. When Jesus spoke to this woman, you're going to notice that she fell before him in fear. And here's the very reason she came silently from behind to touch him instead of coming to him openly. She was afraid of rejection, but she needn't had to. Jesus was not interested in humiliating her. He was not interested in driving her away from his presence. He's not interested in preaching her a sermon on uncleanliness from the law. He was merely interested in helping her with her problem. But Jesus got the response from her he had wanted and anticipated. She came before him, and she bowed at his feet, and she confessed everything to him. And this was that public acknowledgement of what had happened in her heart. She was different, and she wasn't ashamed to tell others about it. And he tells her, "Go in peace." And his words let her know that she has done the right thing in coming to him and touching him. Any other man in that crowd would have been offended and angered had this diseased woman intentionally touched him, but not Jesus. He was not afraid of ceremonial defilement. It couldn't touch him. All he knew was that there was a woman in trouble, and she had exercised a grain of faith the size of a mustard seed, and he only cared for her healing. He didn't ask for anything, but he did it freely out of love and grace. She had already been healed, and she knew it. But the final words of Jesus, "Your faith has made you whole," drive home the fact that she was finally and fully free from her plague. She was healed, and life would never be the same ever again. Her battle with the dreaded disease was forever finished. She had received a brand new life from the hand of the Master. Band, you may make your way forward. Listen, friends. The Bible tells us that Jesus never changes. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus still has the power to heal us, to restore us in our places of deepest need. All of us. In fact, I believe that some of us have been bleeding for much longer than 12 years. So what do you long for Jesus to do for you? What places in your heart are crying out for healing? Where have you lost hope? What do you need to press into Jesus for? Mr. Rogers knew that he needed to press into Jesus to create a holy ground of work for the marginalized, for the least of these. Fred knew that there is a reciprocal relationship between the disenfranchised, those who know they need God, and others. They teach us as we help them. For Mr. Rogers, this practical outpouring of loving your neighbor, using not only your heart and your eyes, but your hands, is what defines a hero. He said to see people who will notice a need in the world and do something about it. And rather than view it with despair, they view it with hope. That to me is such an enormous gift in this life. Those are my heroes. And I believe that when we, like Mr. Rogers, see the face of Christ in everyone, especially children that are in this very room, then we can fully display the work of Christ. Jesus, he saw the sacredness, the humanness of every person, including, if not especially, the outcasts and the least of these. Rather than looking outwardly at others, may we be a church who looks in the heart and sees the face of God in others. Just as Mr. Rogers said, I think everybody longs to be loved and longs to know that he or she is lovable. And consequently, the greatest thing we can do is help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. Amen. As the ushers come forward, I want to take this time to remind you that we have been called with greater purpose. That it is so important that we see the face of God in others. It's so important that we live our lives abundantly giving of our time. As I see these children in this room, I see a generation of our next church. And may we not be people who look past them, but may we look at their hearts and may we do all that we can to make sure that they know who Christ is. I'm going to open this altar for you. If you are someone who needs to come to Jesus, if you are somebody who's ready just to lay this down, say, I'm all in. I'm going to give it over to him because he is our only hope. This is for you, and then we'll finish with our final song.